Chapter 1 Eidos. When I was young, Plato writes in his mid-70s in the manifesto to the friends and associates of Dion, my experience was the same as that of many others. I thought that as soon as I became my own master, I would immediately enter into public life. But it so happened that fateful changes occurred in the political situation. In the government then existing, hated as it was by many, a revolution took place. The revolution was headed by 51 leaders, of whom 30 formed the highest political authority with unlimited powers. Of these, some were relatives and acquaintances of mine, and they invited me to join their administration, as if I were entitled to do so. What I then experienced was not surprising considering my youth, for I imagined that they would administer the state by leading it out of an unjust way of life into a just way, and consequently I paid close attention to see what they would do. What I saw, in fact, was that these men within a short time caused us to look back upon the former government as a golden age. Above all, they tried to send my aged friend Socrates, whom I would, without scruple, call the most just of men then living, along with others after one of the citizens, to take him by force so that he might be put to death, their object being apparently that Socrates, whether he wished it to or not, should be made to participate in their political actions. He, however, refused to obey and risked the worst penalties rather than be a participant in their unholy practices. So when I saw these things and others of a similar serious nature, I was revolted, and I withdrew from these evils. Not long afterward, the power of the 30 was overthrown together with the whole of the government which then existed. And once again, though less urgently, I was seized with the desire to take part in public affairs. Many deplorable events were still happening in those troubled times, and it was not surprising that, in the course of the Revolution, some people took violent revenge on their enemies, although the party returning to power exercised, on the whole, considerable moderation. Yet, as misfortune would have it, certain men of authority summoned our companion Socrates before the law courts, raising against him a most criminal charge, one that Socrates, of all men, least deserved. For the indictment was based on the charge of impiety against the gods of the city, and the judges upheld the indictment and put to death the man who, at the very time when they themselves had the misfortune to be in exile, refused to take part in the criminal arrest of a friend of the exiled party. When, therefore, I considered all this, and the type of men who were administering the affairs of the state, and the laws and customs too, the more I considered all this, and the more I advanced in years myself, the more difficult appeared to me the task of managing the affairs of the state rightly. For it was impossible to take action without friends and loyal companions, and these it was not easy to find among my acquaintance, since our city no longer lived according to the customs and principles of our forefathers. Yet to acquire other, new friends was impossible without great difficulties. Moreover, the corruption in legislation and customs increased to a surprising degree. Thus it happened that I, who was at first filled with an ardent desire to engage in public affairs, finally became dizzy when I viewed all this and saw everything disintegrating around me. Still, not only did I consider to what sort of improvement might be made with regard to these matters, and with regard to the government as a whole, but also as regards political action, I kept constantly waiting for an opportune moment, until finally, looking at all the states that now exist, I came to the conclusion that one and all they were badly governed. For the state of their laws is such as to be almost incurable, unless perchance some action of an astonishing sort coincides with good luck. So I was compelled, praising true philosophy, to declare that she alone enables men to discern what is justice in the state and in the lives of the individuals. The generations of mankind, therefore, would have no cessation from evils until either the class of those who are true and genuine philosophers came to political power, or else the men in political power, by some divine dispensation, became true philosophers. This was the conviction I held when I came to Italy and Sicily at the time of my first arrival. This is Plato's view in retrospect. As an old man, upon the period of his growth between the ages of 18 and 40, according to Goethe, nobody can share the peculiar way in which an individual looks back upon his past life. and one would be grateful for additional evidence that might complement Plato's testimony or permit us to look upon this testimony from a different perspective. But for an understanding of how Plato came to be what he finally was, there remains only this fragment of an autobiography. To be sure, it must stand up against the view of many who have denied the Platonic authorship of the Manifesto, and against the skepticism of Nietzsche, who would give no credit to a history of Plato's life written by himself, as little as to Rousseau's or to the Vita Nuova of Dante. The autobiographical testimony runs counter to most of the prevalent conceptions about Plato. He has come to occupy his place in the history of Western philosophy under the influence of Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Socrates. He is viewed as having discovered philosophical truths, and later philosophers continued to work on his problems. After the systems we have named came the philosophy of Plato, which in most respects followed these thinkers, but which had peculiarities that distinguished it from the philosophy of the Italians, Pythagoreans. Creative power can hardly be more narrowed down to the dimension of doctrinal history than it is in this passage by Aristotle, Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 6. Indeed, it is he who is primarily responsible for this kind of theoretical construction, though it may be questioned whether Plato, at times, could not see himself in such a perspective. If we take what Socrates, in the Phaedo, says about the stages of his own philosophical growth as being somehow autobiographical on Plato's part, we do not know the answer, and there is no hint of it in the letter. The retrospect of the letter, to be sure, is not complete, as is quite evident from the reference to the term philosophy at the end of the passage just cited. Nothing is said about how Plato came to this philosophy. He is conscious of having discovered a metaphysical world, and the true philosophy of which he speaks in the letter is the knowledge of the eternal forms and their true being. But Plato did not set out in quest of this world. He set out in quest of the best state, and on this quest he discovered the world of forms. How this is meant may be seen more clearly when we consider the historical conditions under which Plato grew up. He was not destined, either by the place and time of his birth or by virtue of the social class to which he belonged, to lead the life of the philosopher in the manner in which for centuries now, and partly through Plato's own influence, a person is born into the mainstream of philosophy in the Western world. When I entered into philosophy, wrote Wilhelm Dilthey, in a manner characteristic of a modern philosopher, Plato could not have used such an expression, for the intellectual position of a person born of a noble family in Athens at the beginning of the Great War was altogether different. At a time when the sun of Homer had already risen over the Ionian shores, Attica, a small country of landed proprietors, farmers, and seamen, still slumbered at the dawn of a new era. The waves of science and philosophy rising in Miletus and spreading to the colonial settlements in southern Italy did not touch Athens, while in the colonies minds were busy calculating solar eclipses or drafting maps of the earth or inquiring into the basic structure of the universe. Solon and Peistratos were building the state of Athens and opening its doors to the rich arts of the East, while in Ionia and Magna Graecia the system of pure being competed with the law of opposites hidden in the eternal flux, and while other thinkers carried further the research into the order and basic stuff of the physical world, Athens founded the state of free citizens, defeated the Persians, and created tragic poetry. To be sure, Anaxar, Anaxar, Anaxagoras came to Athens as the first great representative of the Ionian philosophy of nature, and won the statesman Pericles as well as the poet Euripides to his new doctrines. But he was a stranger, and so were the younger physiologists who in Athens met with applause, ridicule, or enmity, and soon skeptical conclusions began to appear as a result of the contradictions inherent in these philosophies of nature and of the epistemological inquiries of the older thinkers. Gorgias and Protagoras, the sophists, also came to Athens as visitors. The Athenian youth ran after them because they offered a new kind of contest and new weapons in the struggle for power. But while the vendors of these novel products were received with honors, no Athenian citizen would have cared to share their trade. Would you not be ashamed of yourself to appear as a sophist before the Hellenes? Socrates asks young Athenian rushing out to become a pupil of Protagoras. Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, to confess the truth, I should be. From Protagoras 312, section A. This reply of the young man might have been the confession of every well-bred Athenian. Aristotle reports, in the same passage where he places the philosophy of his teacher in the history of metaphysical systems, that Plato, when young, had become familiar with the Heracleitian Cratylus, and had learned from him the doctrine of eternal flux and the impossibility of true knowledge. Socrates, however, had shown him that ethical concepts contained a common element not found in the world of sensible things, and Plato had called this element an idea. It would be a misunderstanding of Aristotle if this account, which makes sense only in so far as it points in the direction of his own problems, were to be taken as a historical account of Plato's intellectual growth. If that were the case, it would be even possible to assume that the skeptical period in Plato's life was preceded by a materialistic one. One would have only to take Socrates' description in Phaedo of his own philosophical development as a biographical account applying to Plato. But aside from modern reconstructions of this kind, we do not know in the least how deeply Plato was affected by philosophical ideas, to which he was exposed through Cratylus and others. And even if this influence did lead him to the point of despairing of all knowledge, which incidentally sounds more like the case of Dr. Faustus than that of a man in classical antiquity, there was always practical reality. If he had been able to act, speculative broodings of this kind might have vanished, as they did in the case of the young Bismarck, who overcame Byronic world weariness and Feuerbach skepticism once he plunged into the world of action. No, an Athenian citizen tracing his genealogy to Solon would wish, even at the end of the 5th century, only to enter upon a political career. To become a leading man in the city, that is the aspiration of every young man. Of Alcibiades in Plato's dialogue of the same name, of Plato's brother Glaucon in Xenophon's Memorabilia, of Plato himself, according to the retrospect of the Great Letter. However, there was one fundamental difference between him and the others. For him, this career raised deep personal and intellectual problems, leading to the turning point in his life. The more a person's life is concerned with the quest for the essential, the more likely he is to perceive a symbolic meaning in what is happening before his eyes. Plato saw the disintegration of Athens in the fate of Socrates. If Athens could no longer tolerate its most loyal servant, who was always ready to die for the city, and finally did die for its laws, if the aristocratic revolutionaries wanted to involve him in the moral responsibility of their misdeed, involve Socrates, who had always opposed the arbitrary rule of momentary majorities, and who had always pleaded for a government of the best, if, finally, the democratic restoration condemned this very man who had refused to become a partner of the oligarchy in criminal proceedings against a member of the Democratic Party, then Plato felt the city created and made great by the ancestors had deteriorated to a level of meaningless political drifting. To be a statesman or politician was not yet a separate profession when Plato considered such a career seriously. For when Aristotle defined man as a political animal, he expressed conceptually what was tacitly taken for granted in real life. How to win arete and how to become a statesman were questions facing every young man, and both questions were ultimately one and the same. If he could not become a political man, this did not mean, as it does today, that he would have to choose a different profession. It meant that the essential part of man's existence was denied, since the time of the Stoic sage or the Christian saint had not yet come. Thus the impossibility of a political career, symbolized in the fate of Socrates, meant for Plato either the destruction of one's own life or the demand to build a new life on an entirely different foundation for both the individual and the state. And had not Socrates shown how this was to be done? It was no longer a question of patching up old institutions. It was a question of the remaking of man. Without making man virtuous, it was impossible to conceive of the arete of the city. Socrates, by constantly asking the question, "What is virtue?" had already begun the work of restoration. He alone knew what was necessary. He was the only Athenian practicing the true art of politics. When Plato, through the mouth of Socrates, presented the challenge that philosophers should be rulers, or the rulers of the city philosophers, this was not a manifestation of an excess of philosophical pride, as Jacob Burckhardt called it. It was rather an epigrammatic formulation of a profound insight dawning upon the statesman in Plato as a result of his personal experience at that moment in history and as a result of his encounter with Socrates. The more a person's life is concerned with the quest for the essential, the more likely he is to perceive a symbolic meaning in what is happening before his eyes. Plato saw the disintegration of Athens in the fate of Socrates. If Athens could no longer tolerate its most loyal servant, who was always ready to die for the city and finally did die for its laws, if the aristocratic revolutionaries wanted to involve him in the moral responsibility for their misdeed, involve Socrates, who had always opposed the arbitrary rule of momentary majorities, and who had always pleaded for a government of the best, if, finally, the democratic restoration condemned this very man who had refused to become a partner of the oligarchy in criminal proceedings against a member of the Democratic Party, then Plato felt the city created and made great by the ancestors had deteriorated to a level of meaningless political drifting. To be a statesman or politician was not yet a separate profession when Plato considered such a career seriously. For when Aristotle defined man as political animal, he expressed conceptually what was tacitly taken for granted in real life. How to win arete and how to become a statesman were questions facing every young man, and both questions were ultimately one and the same. If he could not become a political man, this did not mean, as it does today, that he would have to choose a different profession. It meant that the essential part of man's existence was denied, since the time of the Stoic sage or the Christian saint had not yet come. Thus the impossibility of a political career, symbolized in the fate of Socrates, meant for Plato either the destruction of one's own life or the demand to build a new life on an entirely different foundation for both the individual and the state. And had not Socrates shown how this was to be done? It was no longer a question of patching up old institutions. It was a question of the remaking of man. Without making man virtuous, it was impossible to conceive of the arete of the city. Socrates, by constantly asking the question, "What is virtue?" had already begun the work of restoration. He alone knew what was necessary. He was the only Athenian practicing the true art of politics. When Plato, through the mouth of Socrates, presented the challenge that philosophers should be rulers, or the rulers of the city philosophers, this was not a manifestation of an excess of philosophical pride, as Jacob Burckhardt called it. It was rather an epigrammatic formulation of a profound insight dawning upon the statesman in Plato, as a result of his personal experience at that moment in history, and as a result of his encounter with Socrates. In the last analysis, we cannot but share with Plato the peculiar way in which he looked back upon his past life. To be sure, this life is too rich to be described by a simple formula, however general. Yet he undoubtedly saw what was the most essential aspect of it, and this is confirmed by his own writings. The Republic and the Laws by far surpass in size alone any other work of Plato's. A survey of the total body of his writings must place the Republic in the center of his entire literary production. In fact, it is legitimate to consider most of the earlier dialogues as a preparation directly leading to the Republic. The inner structure of the Republic, in turn, is determined by the thesis that the true rulers and the true philosophers are identical. It contains at its very center, 473 CD to 499 B, the pointed epigram of the seventh letter about the philosopher kings. Finally, Plato's own life shows repeated attempts to realize this apparent paradox in the political events of his own times. What then does the paradox mean? This question may be answered by a brief digression on the nature of the Greek state. Originally, the Greek state is firmly based on a divine or religious foundation. In Homer, it is Zeus who grants scepter and ruling power to the kings. In Hesiod, Themis is the wife of Zeus. Both have, besides the Fates, which bring good and evil to mortals, three other daughters, the Horai, their names Eunomia, Dike, and Irene represent the basic principles underlying all human or political communities. Even a criminal or a tyrant who violated the law of the state acknowledged its divinity when he used the terms Themis or Dike. Later, when this original stability was subjected to questions and doubts, Heraclitus secured the foundations of the state in the order of the cosmos. Why should the people fight for the law as for their city wall? Because the orders of the state is part of the larger order of the world. For all human laws are nourished by one which is divine. It governs as far as it will, and is sufficient for all, and more than sufficient. The line of thought expanding the rule of decay to the universe may be found in most of the earlier thinkers. Anaximander looked upon the destruction of existing things as a giving of justice and reparation for the injustice of their coming into being. Parmenides entrusted into the hands of decay the keys to the gate through which the paths of day and night cross, and also the chains binding together the one being. For Heraclitus, too, decay was a symbol of universal necessity. The sun will not transgress his measures, otherwise the Furies, constables of decay, will find them out. And when Heraclitus identifies the contrary powers of law and strife, this mythical expression reveals quite transparently his primary vision of the universal principle of the hidden harmony of opposites. Thus, the legal order of the state was raised to the metaphysical order of the universe, and the city and its laws recaptured in thought some of the sublimity they lost when the religious foundations were dissolving. For those foundations were not so secure but that they disintegrated within the span of a few generations. The separation of the individual from the community grew rapidly, both in the lives and thoughts of men. A survey of other peoples and different customs led to a comparison with one's own norms, and this comparison, in turn, shook the conviction of the uniqueness of one's own beliefs and institutions as well as the faith in their necessity. The fate of the great individuals of the tragic age had already shown the concept of justice, heretofore firmly grounded in the city and religion, in a problematic light. Now, the twofold speech of the sophists taught that just and unjust were one and the same. What was just at one time might be unjust at another, or the unjust might be as good as the just, even better. Critias constructed a theory of human civilization similar to that of Democritus and Epicurus and the philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment, according to which a few wise individuals set up social laws to conquer man's bestial inclinations in the state of nature in order that decay might be the ruler and have insolence as her slave. Just as human, or all too human, was Antiphone's conception of nomos as artificially constructed and practiced, the result of a social contract. What for Heraclitus had been a part of the universal order of nature now became its counterpart, a hostile opponent. What is just according to the laws of the city is, in most cases, hostile to nature, and what the laws lay down as useful puts nature into chains. Pindar had hailed Nomos as king of all gods and men. The sophist Hippias, as he appears in Plato, hates Nomos as a tyrant who coerces contrary to nature. Other sources reveal the gradual breakup of the old structure joining city and universe. One of the hostile brothers confronting each other in Euripides' Phoenician Woman still claims his power in the name of the law, but the law is no longer divine for him. The other openly acknowledges tyranny as the greatest of goddesses. The mother fails to reconcile the fraternal strife, for she has only the goddess equality, Isotes, to call upon for help. Isotes has decreed measure and balance for man. According to her law, it comes to pass that the night's lustreless eye and the sun's light move in the perennial equal circle of the year. In the same manner, it is said she also governs men in cities, and joins together friend with friend, city with city, and comrade with comrade in battle. But when the divinity of decay is forgotten, Isotes reveals herself as a verbal ghost without power over men's souls. The sacred bond is dissolved and disrupted. Arbitrariness is let loose in the world, and the tyrannical man is set free from the bonds of decay. Plato met Socrates. He heard him inquiring into the meaning of justice and the other virtues, and this inquiry gave direction to his own, as yet vague, inclination to strive after the commonweal. There is nothing more urgent to me than to become as virtuous as possible, and for this I believe no one can be of more decisive help to me than yourself. This is Alcibiades speaking to Socrates in the Symposium, and Plato must have spoken to him or felt toward him similarly. And from Socrates he either heard or thought he heard the words that, in Alcibiades Major, he put into the mouth of Socrates speaking to the young Alcibiades. None of your plans can find fulfillment without me, for so strongly do I prevail over you in your affairs. Thus Plato came to acknowledge the life and death of the master as his own fate. Plato possessed what Socrates did not seem to need, the plastic eye of the Greeks, an eye akin to that by which Polykleitos perceived the cannon in the runners and javelin throwers of the Palaestra. Phidias envisaged Homer's picture of Zeus in the Zeus-like men, and also to the eye by which Greek mathematicians looked at the pure geometric forms. Plato seems to have been aware of this gift, stronger in him than in any other thinker. Or is it an accident that we first find in him the metaphor eye of the soul? Before Plato, we find similarly daring formulations in poetry. Aeschylus speaks of an understanding endowed with eyes, and Pindar conversely of a blind heart. Moreover, poet philosophers like Parmenides, Empedocles, and Epicharmos raise the demand that we must see with our minds, an expression partly poetical, partly epistemological, which stands in contrast to physical vision. This is echoed in sophistic literature, for example, when Gorgias speaks about the explorers of the above, who make the incredible and the hidden clear to the eyes of the imagination. And similarly, when the sophistic author of a Hippocratean work contrasts, in the case of a physician, the eye of the body with the vision of the mind. All this is quite Greek, however different in its various formulations, but it is still far from the plasticity and systematic meaning of the Platonic image. Not so far from the last examples is the statement in the Symposium that the mind's vision begins to perceive critically and distinctly as the bodily eye fails in strength. Yet Plato goes much farther than that. While in a beautiful allegory in the Alcibiades Major, he compared the process of knowledge with the vision of the human eye. He carried this parallelism to its ultimate stage in the allegory of the cave in the Republic, comparing the world of the soul and the world of the body, or the organ in the soul by which we learn the truth, and the eye of the body. Plato refers to the leaden weights of sensuality, which turn the vision of the soul downward and away from true reality. Later, the mathematical sciences and astronomy are said to purify and rekindle an organ in every soul. When its light is dimmed or extinguished by other interests, an organ better worth saving than a thousand eyes, because it is our only means of seeing the truth. From here it is only a small step to calling this organ the eye of the soul. Buried in mud, it is gradually drawn and led upward by the dialectical method to the highest intelligible forms. These forms had just been compared again to the noblest vision of the visible world. Thus, after a long preparation, the final picture, closely connected with the metaphysical theory of illumination and the intuition of forms, at last emerges. The soul, interpreted after the model of the body, has eyes to see, but these eyes look upon the eternal forms. Plato is a poet philosopher who does not repeat himself without purpose in his choice of images. The myth of the soul in Phaedrus visualizes the chariot, the charioteer, and the plumage of the soul. The image of the eye would not quite fit into this context, but we are tempted to think of the allegory in the Republic as we encounter, again and again, expressions from the world of vision. The immortal souls see what is beyond the heavens. The mind of the god, in his journey through the heavens, sees justice itself, sees measure, sees truth, and after it has seen the world of true being and has nourished itself, it returns home. As far as human souls are concerned, best of them can just reach with the head of the charioteer into the outer regions and barely see true being. But it is part of the nature of human souls that they once beheld the essences. And whenever man's mind grasps the one form in the midst of many appearances, this is due to remembering what the soul beheld while following the god. Here one could often substitute the phrase eye of the soul. It is almost like the solution to a riddle when, in the Symposium, Diotima shows Socrates what he will learn at the end of his ascent to beauty. Pure, unmixed, and unaffected by any moral triviality, one of a kind, the divinely beautiful becomes visible. He perceives it with that by which it can be perceived. We add readily with the eye of the soul. And for the last time, the same image reappears in the sophist. The philosopher, it is said, resides with the archetypes of being, but because of the splendor of this place, he is not easily seen. For the eyes of the soul of most people are incapable of looking at the divine. Only once in Nicomachean Ethics does Aristotle call thinking the eye of the soul, and this image is so strange in the midst of the matter of factness of Aristotle's style that the reference to Plato cannot be missed. Even the stories according to which the cynics ridicule the eye, by which we see hoarseness, and the mind by which we see tableness, may go back to Plato's own lifetime. Later, Epicurus, or one of his pupils, while attacking the Platonic cosmology, satirizes the eyes of the mind with which Plato had viewed the workshop of the world. Apparently, the inevitable chatter had seized upon the great image quite early. In later periods, the image is usually found in the writings of Platonists, Philo, Plotinos, Proclus, and St. Augustine. When it occurs in other authors, it is apparent in one way or another that the flower was picked from Plato's garden. It is no accident that Plato, as far as we know, was the first to speak of the eye of the soul, and that he does so especially in those passages where he envisages the highest stages of his philosophy, or that, even if he does not use the phrase, his language of myth and allegory belongs in the same area. How he found his own way to this vision he suggests in the dialogues by making Socrates lead the way to the goal. Even the man who in the allegory of the cave succeeds in throwing off the chains and making the ascent bears marks of Socrates. For when this man returns to those still in chains to free them and to lead them upward, they would kill him if only they could lay their hands on him. Plato could not have said it more clearly who was responsible for his own conversion and descent to that region where he first learned to see the real shadows of real things, then their mirror images, and finally the things themselves, and the sun. Thus it was through and as it were in Socrates that he beheld with the eye of the soul the just itself, and likewise the courageous, or the temperate, and the wise, in general the virtues, or the virtue. To be sure, everybody was talking about virtue, whether it was teachable or not, and everybody meant something else by the threadbare name, preferably what pleased him at the moment. Socrates was the only one who not only tried to clarify the meaning of the word, although he did this too, more seriously and more persistently than anybody else, but who bore witness through his life and death to the existence of virtue. Through his presence, Plato's eye of the soul gained access to the world of forms. For what is eidos and idea? Something to which we gain access through sight. Possibly the word idea originally referred more to sight itself, in which the act of seeing and the visible object are combined. The word eidos more to what is seen, the image, form, gestalt as the object of vision. At any rate, the two words became practically synonymous. Their meaning is generally believed to have been worn down with time. It might be more correct to say that this meaning was transferred from an outward appearance to inner form and structure. Herodotus says, leaves of such a form or kind, and means the corrosive effect of juice. For example, nothing concretely or immediately visible, or he has somebody think in a twofold form. Ionian physicians deny, against the claim of the natural philosophers, that there is such a thing as something warm or cold or dry or wet by itself, which has nothing in common with any other form of being. They speak of the four kinds of wet, for example, phlegm, gall, water, blood; of the sweet juice which is transformed into another kind; of the many forms of diseases, to which correspond the various types of medicine, or of the kinds of bandages, fever, and medication. These expressions have the character of classifications, but it is the concept of form that determines the classification, just as in other classifications it is the concept of origin, or of direction. The same writers speak of the knobby form of the thigh bone, or the kidney as having the shape of the heart, or again, even more symbolically, of the nature of man, his age and form, to which the physician must pay attention. Aristophanes puts something always newly formed on the stage, and his chorus sings in a different hymnic form. Thucydides, according to his interpreters, is supposed to have used the word idea in the weakened meaning of kind or manner. Now, we might speak of many kinds of war, every kind of death, or the manner of escape or destruction, but we need not assume that for the Greeks these words lacked precise plasticity as they do for us. Even we speak of the picture of an illness, and where we translate the visible form into a pale general concept, a language much more sensitive to sensuous meanings than ours might well have envisaged something much more plastic and visible. Plato shares the ordinary use of the words eidos and idea, but in his case too we must not give a general and colorless meaning to words that in Greek are much more sharply stamped. He might say the syllable arises out of its component sounds as a unity, but he does say as a unitary form, as a unitary structure, something that catches the eye. Plato does not ask whether the soul is dual or triple, whether it has two or three parts, but whether it has two or three forms, meaning, as it were, the complete shape and visually apparent structure of each. If finally he also gives the name eidos or idea to the truly just, the beautiful as truly existent, the good itself, we must be careful not to substitute it for the worn out notion idea. We must also be careful in speaking about a theory of ideas, except in the case of the old Plato, who once used this somewhat rigid conceptual scheme in letter 6. Ultimately, it means very little to know what Plato's sources for the term were, whether he took it from the physicians, the natural philosophers, or the rhetoricians, who used the word form and structure with reference to the overall picture of an illness, the basic elements of the body, phlegm, gall, blood, the basic qualities of nature, warm and cold, dry and moist, the physical atoms, the figures of speech, or whether he took it from another field of current language. Visible forms he called the invisible eternal essences, without trying to aim at terminological precision, but perhaps not without a sense for the paradox contained in the expression, because the term seemed to convey better than any other that the just, as truly existent, or the courageous itself, was to him something that he was able to see with the eyes of his soul. Socrates was, so it is said since the days of Aristotle, the discoverer of the concept and the definition, and Plato made the idea out of the concept. What does the reality look like that it is here projected onto a plane of conceptual abstraction? To be sure, Socrates asked indefatigably, what is justice? What is the good? What is techne or Sophia or anything else you talk about all the time? But his final purpose was not the discovery of a concept, just as he was never satisfied with any definition he reached. Behind every and any question raised there was the final question: how should man live in the service of the city, which requires the virtuous man, and in the service of God, who requires the good man in a well ordered city? Socrates knew that there was an answer to this question, because he was that kind of man, and that knowledge determined the form of his dialogues. In and through his inquiries, he turned to where an answer might be found. He asked, what is? Hence, there must be something that is. But only Plato's eyes saw it, and in the Idos he found what Socrates had taught his students to seek, and what Socrates himself had lived. It is not a matter of biographical curiosity if we try to understand tentatively how Plato grasped the idea. It must also be apparent by now that we are not dealing with a subject that might be important from a historical or biographical point of view, but is philosophically insignificant. Idea has a history of more than 2,000 years, and there is no other word in the philosophical vocabulary that is so heavily weighted down by the conceptual labors of centuries. Plato's eidos alone is not a philosophical concept derived from earlier philosophies, as is every inquiry made into the status of ideas since and because of Plato. This is precisely the reason why we should try to lay bare the original sense of the term. To be sure, there is no historical tradition about Plato's primary experience. We must not be misled, however, by a view still sometimes found plausible, that the visible, aesthetic, and intuitive component of the idea, which could hardly be overlooked entirely, is a contamination, pardonable perhaps because so characteristically Greek, but still a contamination of the intellectual purity of the concept, an intellectual fall from grace. On the contrary, we must try to take the term that Plato used to describe his experience simply and concretely, and to see it within the context of his myths and allegories. Precisely because it has an intuitive origin, we must not begin by defining conceptually what the idea is. For Plato himself, the idea, though the highest object of knowledge, is never entirely definable in conceptual terms. We must also be careful not to identify Plato's intuition with an ecstatic act in the ordinary sense of the word. We shall attempt to focus upon the point where Plato, in quest of the true city, encountered that dimension for the designation of which he used the words eidos and idea. From here we must then try to penetrate the whole structure of his work. For one whose inner eye had seen the eternal forms with the same, or rather with an incomparably greater, certainty than bodily eyes see the visible shapes, the heuristic double talk of the sophists made no sense at all. To say that good and bad were one and the same, or that one and the same thing might be good for this person or bad for that person, or for the same person now good and now bad, and that this was also true of beautiful and ugly, just and unjust, true and false, all these statements were like a play with empty words for one who had seen the beautiful, the just, and the true. He could no longer ask whether there was such a thing as justice, or whether the word was useful in a public contest but otherwise meaningless. He could not doubt that justice could be taught. If there was such a thing as justice, if it was an eidos, then a person became just when he looked at justice. Or do you consider it possible, says Socrates in the Republic, that a man would not imitate that with which he lives in admiring companionship? So the philosopher, in constant companionship with the divine order of the world, will reproduce that order in his soul, and as far as man may, become godlike. But if this was valid, then the task was clear: to open the eyes of others to what he himself had seen. Not only the education of the individual was at stake. If the city disintegrated because Themis and Dike were no longer honored at its hearth, it was necessary to found a new state around the eidos of justice, around the eidos in general, and eventually around the idea of the good at its center as the divine principle of order and stability. This and nothing else is meant by Plato's epigram, according to which there will be no end to evils unless philosophers become rulers, or the rulers genuine seekers after the truth. It is just another expression of that systematic connection which always existed for him between Eidos and Polis, not because of any conceptual construction, but because of an experienced necessity. How could others be taught to see what only Plato's inner eye saw, what, according to Schopenhauer, is only attainable by the man of genius, and is therefore not absolutely, but only conditionally communicable? How could one be sure at all that this was knowledge and truth, the only kind of knowledge and highest truth? Indeed, as the seventh letter has it, it cannot be put into words like other studies, and Plato always talked about the eternal forms in suggestions only. But he knew that mere opinions run out of the human soul, so that they are not worth much until they are fastened by conceptual ties of the understanding of their cause. Even if what he had glimpsed was unspeakably far removed from opinion and appearance, it was necessary to use the support of words in order to make the intuition last for himself and others. To discover these intellectual ties became the content of his philosophical inquiry, to lead men through a long communion to a point where a light is kindled in the soul by a leaping spark from letter 7. This is the basis of all his teaching. What has just been said may perhaps be further clarified by a brief digression. When Goethe, at the memorable meeting with Schiller on July 14th, 1794, vividly developed his metamorphosis of plants and created before Schiller's eyes, with a few characteristic pen strokes, a symbolic plant, Schiller shook his head and said, "That is not experience, that is an idea." He meant, of course, an idea in the Kantian sense as a necessary concept of reason for which there is no corresponding object of the senses. Goethe, somewhat annoyed, hesitated. This difference between experience and idea, introduced by a speculative mind, was incomprehensible and annoying to him. The intuitive mind, as Schiller was to call him shortly later, at the beginning of their correspondence. "That's a strange business," he replied, "that I have ideas without knowing it, and that I even see them with my own eyes. Not a Kantian idea, but a Platonic idea in its original meaning." This was Goethe's Umpflanz, plant archetype. Goethe knew that there is a difference between seeing and seeing, that the eyes of the mind must constantly cooperate with the eyes of the body in a living bond, because otherwise there is a danger that we see and still miss seeing. Wir Mann sonst in Gefahr kommen zu sehen und doch vorbeizuhin. He saw with his own eyes, with the eyes of his soul. Plato would have said, the Ermpflanz in the palm tree in the botanical gardens of Padua. He hoped to discover it among the plants of the public gardens at Palermo. And if, according to his own words, he completely understood the original identity of all parts of plants in Sicily and now tried to trace and rediscover this identity everywhere, this kind of understanding is in the last analysis the intuitive grasp, and what follows is an attempt to recapture the original vision through the power of the Logos. To return to Plato, when one speaks about the conceptual ties with which he captured and communicated his intuition, one should be warned, to begin with, that this cannot be done in the form of tracing a gradual historical development. An apparently genetic approach is used only in order to disclose the structure of his thought, not unlike the method Plato himself used in the Timaeus when he told the myth of the creation of the world, but warned his readers not to take the successive stages of the creation literally. Plato may have been well versed in the systems of earlier thinkers. According to ancient tradition, he was well acquainted with the Heraclean Cratylus, so we can assume that he was at least familiar with this trend of thought. One thing is certain, though invariably ignored, his philosophy did not grow out of earlier systems. Only after his eyes had been opened to the eidos did he turn the energy of his being, with enormous intensity, in this one direction. Only then did Plato become, in an entirely new sense, a philosopher. What one must try to find is the law according to which the substance of his thinking was focused around this point rather than the historical order in which this may have taken place. If Plato wished to preserve his intuition for himself and others, he had to use the materials of language. The just, or the beautiful, which he perceived with the eyes of his soul, alone bore the mark of true being. If he wished to avoid confusion between the beautiful and a beautiful girl, and this was at times necessary, as is shown in the Hippias Major, he might add the beautiful itself. In addition, he had another phrase at his disposal, a newly coined expression bandied about during the time of the Sophists. The phrase being, or in existence, used in contradistinction from mere appearance or the unreal, is known from Euripides and Aristophanes. Thus Plato referred to the good as being, or the beautiful as being. Or he enlarged this expression to the knowledge of the equal itself, what it really is, from the Phaedo, and even gave this phrase a slightly terminological shade, all upon which we stamp that name, what it really is, or that which really is. Again from Phaedo. These expressions, which Plato took from the current language of his age and developed further, had important consequences, for they placed him in the tradition of the search for the true being, which extended from Gorgias, Melissos, and Zeno back to the great Parmenides, the discoverer of the one eternal, immutable being. Plato did not have to be conscious of this historical context, and perhaps was not conscious of it, just as people today are not aware of using the language of St. Paul when they say all in all, or the language of Comte when they say I am positive. Yet it was not accidental that Plato turned in the direction of the most original and powerful inquiry into being. The prevailing history of philosophy gives a somewhat wrong impression about who Socrates really was. He is generally considered the one who, as Cicero puts it, brought philosophy down from the heavens to earth. It is difficult indeed to find any connection between the early scientific thinking and Socrates' method of never ending questions. Would it be possible at all to place the Eleatic thinker and the philosophers of nature in one and the same history of philosophy, possible without Plato, who in his own person combined the critical and educational power of Socrates with the speculations of the earlier thinkers? This question does not seem to be recognized, yet there is a hidden connection. Socrates lived and taught among the sophists. For the majority of the people, he was indistinguishable from them. For Aristophanes, literally their representative. To see the profound difference required the keen eye of Plato. Sophistic speculation still retained, in its legerdemain with being and not being, Parmenidean elements, though these had become not much more than verbal exercises. Now the contrast to the sophists, while not determining the nature of Socrates, did influence the kind of question he asked. When he asked, "What is justice?" and knew that justice is, he did not have to know that, although pursuing a different goal, he still followed the kind of inquiry originally posed by Parmenides. With this Socratic question, and with every attempt to name the newly perceived forms and to demarcate them from that with which they must not be confused, Plato took over current linguistic and conceptual terms, which ultimately owed their origin to Parmenides. But Plato could not be satisfied with these watered down expressions, especially not as far as his highest intuitions were concerned. Departing from the derivative speculations, he returned to their origin. As a philosopher, he did not inherit, as Aristotle did from him or Kant from the English empiricists, certain problems that his predecessors had failed to solve. Rather, the Parmenidean philosophy of being provided him with the means to anchor his intuition in permanent thoughts and words. Now it is true that, in place of the simple, immutable, spherical being that the intuitive fantasy of this first ontologist, this awkward yet great poet, had also perceived with his mind, Plato knew an abundance of visions, which were increased and enlarged with every new perception, and even though they drove toward unity, never again achieved the lonely rigidity of Parmenides' being. However, despite this contrast, we can see a remarkable agreement down to the level of language. It is the very predicates of the Parmenidean being, whole, simple, immutable, that Plato transferred to his archetypes. while Zeno proved the sole existence of the Parmenidean being from the contradictions resulting from postulating the existence of many things. Plato pointed to the contradictions resulting from thinking of the just, beautiful, or pious in their multiple appearances, instead of in their uniqueness of ideal being. But more than that, the entire structure of his world of being and of the corresponding stages of knowledge, as shown most clearly in the Republic, is strictly Parmenidean. For both thinkers, being is diametrically opposed to absolute non being. For both, not being is unknowable. How could not being be known? Asked Glaucon in the Republic. Not being can neither be known nor named, says the goddess to Parmenides. Complete being, on the other hand, is for Plato completely knowable, just as there is only one path of knowledge for Parmenides, namely, that which leads to pure being, and which bears the characteristics of this being as marks. For both, the world in which we live lies between these two poles. It is both being and not being. To this world belongs, according to Plato, the particular form of knowledge that he calls opinion, or doxa. Correspondingly, the intermediary world is called by Parmenides the world according to doxa. Only in his case the word refers inseparably both to confused opinion of the subject and confused appearance of the object. This is the point of difference between these two similar structures of thought. For Parmenides, who ultimately knows only pure being and nothing else, being and thinking are one and the same. Just as in the intermediary world of doxa, the ontological status of the object and the mode of knowledge are fused with each other. Plato, who incorporates the abundance of intuited forms into his world of being, and for whom, because of Socrates, man or the soul is one of the highest experiences, could no longer envisage so simple a construction. He adopted the basic plan, yet he envisaged different degrees of reality precisely corresponding to different degrees of knowledge. Eventually, far transcending Parmenides, he constructed a harmonious system of being and knowledge. But this cannot be treated here, where we are concerned only with what he adopted from previous thinkers in order to give conceptual firmness to his own intuition. Even today, it is still seriously believed, a view that, at least in tendency, is reminiscent of Aristotle, that Plato constructed his system by adding the Heraclitean world of becoming to the Parmenidean world of being. But no organic system of thought results from mere addition, and Plato was concerned with other things than a place in the history of ideas. He had caught sight of the eidos, and was then confronted with the task of making his intuition permanently visible through the logos. Now it is certain that permanent being can be posited only in contrast to some other mode of existence. Thus, the Indian thinkers also gave different names, such as inconstancy, change, suffering, not self, to the world that is opposed to the eternal Atman. Plato did not have to search for new words. Parmenides did not desert him when he looked for terms to designate that which we ordinarily in every life call being. The Parmenidean formulation, being as well as not being, serves in the ontological system of the Republic to refer our world of becoming to the world of true being, and, paradoxically, at the same time, to mark the eternal distance of the former to the latter. Parmenides, moreover, had separated pure being from unreality, the world of becoming and passing away, growth and decay. Plato adopted these words because they corresponded precisely to his own view, and because he was not so dependent that he had to give the appearance of originality. In that very moment, it may be supposed he saw Heraclitus and Parmenides in conjunction. Perhaps the comrade of Cratylus did not at first see, as did no one in his age, that Heraclitus had a general element in common with Parmenides, if one did not emphasize becoming and change, but rather the dialectical law of becoming and the permanence of change. But with that power of analysis and synthesis, by which he also distinguished Socrates from the sophists, despite everything they had in common, he pulled apart the Heraclitean and Parmenidean worldviews, much as the creator of the Sistine ceiling divides day and night, and then yoked them together again as a symbol of the opposition between the world of being and the world of becoming. as was required by his discovery of the eternal forms. But there was still a higher perspective in which this duality was rounded again into a unity. One is all, conjoined, disjoined, consonant, dissonant, from all one and from one everything. Thus spoke Heraclitus. For Plato, the one eidos gives to the many individual things a share in true being. The things, in turn, strive for the completeness of the eidos. Only if the one is not without the other is the cosmos joined together with itself. Was this not the Heraclitean worldview, more genuine than the watered down, sophistically abused doctrine of the flux of all things? Plato formulated this harmony of opposites, which is alive everywhere in his construction of the world, most elaborately in the Parmenides, where it has, as it were, been crystallized in the precise dialectics of the one and the other. Paradoxical as it may sound, the dialogue Parmenides is the most strongly Heraclitean work among Plato's writings, and the philosopher Parmenides in this work just as much as Heraclitean as an Eleatic. Here the point is reached where the forces of the two great old masters are united in Plato, as the beginning and end of the circumference of a circle are one and the same. The one wise of Heraclitus, which expressly contains manyness, even allness, and the one being of Parmenides, which is meant to exclude not being and the multitude of things, without being able to do so. For even of being, one speaks with names derived from this world of being and not being, and being is present in the world of appearance. These two perspectives coincide in Plato's world, where being penetrates not being, and unity becomes visible through multiplicity. Besides Parmenides and Heraclitus, Pythagoras was the third among the great early thinkers whose influence reached Plato in the Pythagorean circles of Magna Graecia, and perhaps still earlier in the company of Socrates. What did Pythagoras, this intellectual force, effective through the ages and constantly attracting and permeating new elements, mean to Plato? The one passage in which Plato mentions Pythagoras by name makes him a successor of Homer, the leader of Paideia. Let us remember that Plato, in his formative years, was almost profoundly stirred and shocked by the chaos in the city to which he thought he belonged, and by the disintegration of the men who ruled the city. His final goal was to put order in place of disorder, just as the artisan and artist join pieces to form a well ordered object. So must order prevail in body and soul, family and state, for therein consists the value and perfection of every structure. Thus Plato teaches at the summit of his Gorgias, after the protagonists of sophistic oratory, lust, and caprice, in other words, of disorder, have been vanquished. Nothing is farther removed from Plato than Goethe's remark that he could tolerate injustice rather than disorder. For to Plato, injustice is disorder. Wherever the hateful transgression into someone else's function, into a foreign field of action, is avoided, there Plato finds measure, temperance, and justice. If artisans and artists create order out of perishable material, how much more must this order suit the invisible model to which they look in their creations? Thus, the world of forms, the realm of perfection, cannot be anything but a world of unchanging and harmonious order, where nothing can do or suffer wrong, where all is in order according to reason. The cosmos of numbers, the harmony and proportion of musical strings, and, on a larger canvas, the cosmos of the starry sky were replicas of a perfect being. They pointed upward to a place beyond the heavens. It is, therefore, the sciences of this order, and above all their unity and integration in the Pythagorean system, that moved Plato and seem to have revealed to him in an entirely different realm what he could not find in the states of his time. Cosmos is the structure of the world as it is of the state and of the soul. Geometry binds heaven and earth together. The wise men tell us, Callicles, that communion and friendship and orderliness and temperance and justice bind together heaven and earth, and that this universe is therefore called cosmos or order, not disorder or misrule, my friend. But although you are a wise man, you seem to me never to have observed that geometrical equality, proportion, is mighty both among gods and men. You think you ought to strive ruthlessly after power and excess, for you do not care about geometry. From Gorgias. Now it is apparent what the contact with Pythagoras meant for Plato. Socrates restricted himself to man and the state, and so did Plato by virtue of his origin and the example of his teacher. But while Socrates claimed not to understand anything about the things above, there was something in Plato's soul akin and open to the cosmos, that as the outermost homocentric sphere surrounds man and state. Plato owed to the great Italian philosopher, and the force that still radiated from him, his transcending the state by a search into the cosmos, and conversely, his conceiving of man and state as beings of cosmic rank. That is why Plato has the Pythagorean Timaeus present present his view of the universe after he had Socrates found the ideal state. There was something else that made the Pythagoreans indispensable to Plato. This was the seriousness with which they approached the human soul. Heraclitus had penetrated into his own soul without ever reaching definite limits. The Pythagoreans, and those around Orpheus, spoke in vivid myths about the nature and fate of the human soul. Plato's written work shows a strong interest in these messages about the soul, so strong, in fact, as to suggest the view that, besides everything else, he was also an Orphic theologian. The doctrine of the eternal life and permanence of the individual soul, it is said, can hardly be reconciled with a theory of ideas. Plato, in fact, is supposed to have borrowed this article of faith concerning the soul ready made from the Orphics. But even if a contradiction in Plato's system were to appear, it would be wrong to explain the contradiction as a combination of originally separate doctrines. Plato undoubtedly listened whenever he could hear familiar tones, but he was the last person to fit foreign doctrines arbitrarily into his own system. It is not sufficiently recognized that Plato does not, in the strict sense of the word, teach anything at all about the fate of the human soul. Socrates speaks about it in myths, which are part of the dramatic structure in Plato's works. Plato's references to the authority of the priests and theologians of the mystery religions are undoubtedly an indication of the origin of these mythological symbols, but are in no way an indication of what they meant to Plato himself. For him, they contained a profound symbolic reality. They were venerable allegories, images, and phrases for something that he preferred not to express in his own language. It is a mistake to use them as evidence for a Platonic theory or history of the soul. If Plato had been Parmenides, all of his thinking might have fused in the intuition of the power, immediacy, and as it were, consistency of the agathon, and the result might have been a doctrine of all in one. But Plato was much too conscious of his own humanity, had had, through Socrates, much too powerful an experience of the other human being, of the eros, who leads one person to another, and both to the idea to be satisfied with the Parmenidean identification of thought and being. Since his world fell apart into the realm of not being, perpetual becoming and passing away, and into the realm of eternal being, custodian of every value, the question arose, where does man belong? This question did not arise for him from a theoretical or systematic interest, but because of the necessity of forming a new type of man and of placing him in a new kind of state. In the Alcibiades Major, during a discussion of the Delphic pronouncement, Know thyself, the question is raised, what is the self? The answer is paradoxical. For a Greek, much more so than for a citizen of the Christian world, man is soul. This means that the soul is that which characterizes man intrinsically, is his existence, constitutes his essence. To use the language of Plotinus, the idea of man is formed after that which is the prevailing and best element in him. Once Plato has discovered the world of eternal being, man is part of both worlds and of neither. He is between both worlds, belonging to the world of becoming and passing away because of his body and the lower parts of his soul, belonging to the world of being because of the eternal part of his soul. Thus, it is the discovery of the world of ideas that no longer permits man to be altogether a member of one undivided world and forces upon him the separation into body and soul. Plato's doctrine of the eternal and immortal soul is not accepted as a ready-made theology, nor is it proved on the basis of theoretically conclusive arguments. The Phaedo clearly shows two things. Plato considered the belief in an immortal soul justified because of Socrates' victory over death. There was something untouched by the fact of the man Socrates, as he was called, lying dead and about to be buried. I cannot make Creton believe that I am the Socrates who is now speaking and conducting these arguments. He believes that I am the one whom he will soon see as a dead body, and he asks how to bury me. But the arguments for the immortality of the soul, of which none, for good reasons, has been ultimately conclusive, show something else. The eternity of the soul is justified for Plato because of the existence of the idea. To speak of the undyingness of the soul makes sense only for the friends of the ideas. If the human soul is by nature of such a kind that it knows eternal being, then it must itself, for like can only be known by like, have being after the manner of the eternal forms. Just as the arguments for immortality are not accidentally placed within the frame of the story about the death of Socrates, so these two justifications for the eternal existence of the human soul are not juxtaposed accidentally. For Plato had perceived the eternal forms in and through Socrates. Thus, Socrates, Eidos, and immortality are, as it were, three different aspects of the same reality. Man in the city. This was the fact with which Plato, as every Greek, began. The old unquestioned unity was dissolved, but from disunity and the struggle for a new order there arose in Plato his own vision. On the one hand, man or his soul as an inner politeia; on the other, the state as an expanded soul. Soul and state, then, are units with the same structure, in a necessary mutual relation, both oriented toward the eidos and ultimately to the idea of the good. Man in the cosmos, this was the realization to which Pythagoras helped Plato. The vision to which Plato himself progressed was as follows. He saw the small cosmos included in the large cosmos, and both of them as living souls, again in necessary mutual relation, since the stars and the universe possess soul, and the perfect human soul reflects the ordered movement of the universe. Their common principle of order is the agathon, man and the eidos. This was Plato's own experience, which he owed to Socrates, but which he did not share with anyone. The soul received eternal being from the eidos, which it perceived intuitively. The eidos became, or rather was from the beginning, of the nature of soul. For the just, the courageous, the pious, the good, were ideas which Plato first perceived in the soul of Socrates. In his later period, it was inconceivable to him how anyone could deny that complete being had communion with movement, life, thought, or kinship and similarity with mind. Soul and eidos, therefore, of necessity refer to each other, just as the eye of the soul first envisioned the eternal forms, and Plato's subsequent philosophy was an ever repeated effort to hold fast to the world he had discovered. So do the Platonic dialogues mirror these two modes of knowledge in the two movements which led to the eidos, mania and dialectics.